much. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leo Martinez, and I'm a senior manager of training and technical assistance and partnerships at Esperanza United. I'm also within the work that I do at Esperanza United is within under different grants. Right now I'm working on a vicarious trauma response initiative, project with the International Association of Chief of Police, working on a grant managed by the Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence on a language access, peer-to-peer access. And also we are, Esperanza United is considered the federally designated resource center on gender-based violence in the Latino community. So I do a lot of work under the Department of Health and Human Services and FEPSA, which is the Family Violence Prevention Services Act. So it's a good thing to spell out our acronyms. I know we have a lot of them, so I'll try my best to do that when I encounter one. So I'm also that's some of my professional experience. I've been with the Esperanza United for over 5 years, and before that I worked for the Georgia Georgia Family Violence Commission, and before that I did some direct services with an agency called Camino Latino in Atlanta, Georgia. So I have over 10 years of experience, and I've done a lot of work around language access and training around the issues of culture and cultural responsiveness. So this is a presentation fairly new that we're trying to make sure that we can have some conversations. I hope that you can have some of those conversations with me. I'm open to many questions, so feel free to get on video if you want to ask a question, or if you want just to just use sound and not turn off your camera, that's okay. Or you can put your questions also in the chat, and just feel free to do those questions as we go. If the answer is only a couple of slides down the road, I'll let you know. But otherwise, I'd rather just get those questions out of the way as we're going through the presentation. So a little bit about Esperanza United. We already mentioned that we are the National Resource Center on the Latino community, on gender-based violence. But our mission is to unite and mobilize Latinos and Latino communities to end gender-based violence. We used to be called Casa de Esperanza. We had a rebranding about a year ago with the idea that to unify the work that we do. We provide direct services still in the St. Paul and Minneapolis area. And we continue to do that. And we based our work on the work that we do in community. So it was just right for us to rebrand and find a name that it was probably more representative of the work that we do. And Esperanza was always a part of our name before, and we wanted to keep that in there. So we changed our name to Esperanza United. We've been around for about 40 years, and we were started by a group of Latina activists in St. Paul. And we continue to do this, similar work, plus all the work that we are doing at the national level across the country with different organizations, whether they are mainstream, whether they are culturally specific. And you might have seen maybe anything that's been any written materials that you may find that we use the @ sign to use in place of the masculine or feminine, just to referring to people or groups that are gender neutral or both masculine and feminine. We may use Latinx or Latina in Spanish. All of those are, for us are sort of interchangeable, but we also welcome the conversations about how we came up with this @ sign in some of the gendering that would happen in our language. In English, and also more specifically in Spanish. So today, the idea is to talk a little bit about how culture and language intertwine when we're working with survivors who are going through a healing process. Try to, we're going to work a little bit about what cultural responsiveness is and how it relates to a victim service provision. And then talk a little about some practical steps of how can we do some system advocacy when survivors are not offered linguistically and culturally responsive services. So I hope that this is helpful for you, and please feel free to let me know if you have any questions so far. So right now, I would like for you to think, and this is just an activity that you can take a couple minutes, and then you can write in the chat, or you can come on video and let us know. Think back to your earliest memory when you realized there was a group of people different than you. Usually this is about maybe when you were like 4 or 5 years of age, or or earlier, or a little bit later, and think about that group and who were they, and what was the message that you received about that group that was different, and also think if that message was positive, negative, or neutral. So I'll give you a couple minutes to think, and please let me know, and Amelia, if you can help me, if you see any comments or any responses in the chat, please let me know. Anybody? I hope that you are, I'm hoping that you're writing away to a, but yeah, I appreciate if you are brave enough to let me know whatever your experience was. So this is the no judgment zone. So we can talk about our personal experiences sometimes, if it's okay for you to share that. Anybody wants to come on? Okay, let me see. So we have a couple of.
So I says I was surrounded primarily with the Caucasian group. So I was the only Asian first generation kid.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And then Danisha says, I went to a predominantly white school in elementary. My experience was neutral at the time. I didn't have any bad insight until I got to middle school. Okay, but I want to think about a group that was different than you. So, maybe it was a group that was different race, or maybe a group that was different gender identity, or the people with disability, whichever the group that was that you encounter, and you ask your parents maybe. So I see I have Ileana saying at that early age, it was probably people from rural background and different social class. It was hard to see poverty, but also there was a component of how beautiful their environment was. Okay, thank you. And then we have Catherine, says, people who had different skin colors than me. I was told not to mention it. Okay, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for being honest. Sometimes those comments were maybe either not necessarily negative, but maybe neutral, or just to avoid any kind of conversations about it. Let me see who else. About Mark says, about age 5, 6, visited a classmate whose background was Filipino, played outside his house. I recall his mother cooking food. Message received was, this is a positive and bias, similar to mine. Thank you, Mark. Let's see. Catherine says, people who were gay, and same thing, just don't talk about it. Megan says, we had Asian neighbors, and I remember my parents making fun of their speech. Thank you for being honest. Claudia says, the small LGBT community in high school made me more accepting. Thank you. People with white parents, I was told that they were American and they were ignorant and not as smart as those with immigrant parents. Thank you, Jasmine. Amelia says, I remember very clearly that Girl Scouts had family gatherings in the kitchen, that we made a plate for our tios and grandpa and father. I wonder why, but that stands out as a time I realized I was different and would be treated differently than my boy cousins. Thank you. That's very insightful. So thank you very much. If you decided to share with us something personal like that, As you see, there's a variety. I think there's one more, Alma. Says we were taught English first because not Spanish was not known or accepted in the 90s around our neighborhood. We had mostly white elderly neighbors. Thank you, thank you. So as you see, there's all these different early childhood experiences, which tend to, mark a lot of how we think about our surroundings, and our socialization. So, we think of our parents and our teachers or coaches or those who are close to us as someone who will who will be a positive person that will give us positive messages. But if you think back, maybe not necessarily we got positive messages about those around us who were different. So thank you for sharing all of this, because it does help us understand the idea that we are, we have always been involved around people who are different than us, and that we can and that's a journey to understand those who are different than us. And wherever you are in that journey, it's okay. Sometimes we are socialized not to see difference, but like people say, oh, I don't see color, but actually we say, we do see color. We just say, maybe like somebody said, well, they told me just to ignore it or not to say anything about it. And the thing is that we do have to think about our differences and embrace them. So that's why I wanted to share with you this great quote from Audre Lorde about our differences, and it says, it is not our differences that divides us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So, so it's she was incredible thinker, and thinking about how different we all are, we just can think of a concept of culture, because we all have it. We all have culture. Culture is something that is a pattern of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors transmitted from one generation to another, that allows us to adapt to each other and the environment. Culture is not stagnant; it's always changing. So, and there's different subcultures and different depending on groups. Like tonight, I go to a bowl. I go to a bowling league after I'm done with work, and there is a subculture about people who are bowlers. And you might not, if you ever been part of a bowling league, you may know what I'm talking about. So, and that's just an example of different cultures or subcultures, and how they represent different groups within even our different groups. But we usually think of culture or hear about culture when we're talking about immigrants or newcomers, people who are new. So then we tend to think about culture, we hear about culture, because it's usually about other people's culture. But we all have culture. If I ask the question, where's your family from, or where are your family roots, regardless of who you are, you might, I might get all kinds of different countries. People that may say, yes, my family is German, or they were English or Scottish, or Italian, or or Mexican, wherever that is. Some of that, that culture is definitely with you. I think that what is the fact that we sometimes we tend to try to say that we all belong to mainstream culture. It's just a way of us to just not dealing with other people's cultures. And if I ask a question about, for example, your recipe for dressing for Thanksgiving, I probably want to get, I don't know, as many recipes as there is people in this workshop right now, because some people says, oh, I put oysters in it. No, I put this. No, I put that. that depending on where you're from, you're going to have different recipes for that because it's tied up to your culture, tied up to your roots. If I ask, a simple question as to how do you call a soda, I might have, 10, 20 different names for that. I don't know. Some people, they call it pop up north. The other ones, in the south, some they call it a Coke, even though it may not be Coke, but we call everything Coke. So yeah, so they are going to be different, and that's dependent on your local culture, where you are at. Something that is important that we sort of flesh out in regard to culture is three different concepts, and people sometimes use this interchangeably, but they are not. They are very different concepts, like cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. And the concept of cultural competence, I really usually think of it as part of cultural responsiveness, because it is usually focused on knowledge, as acquired knowledge. Let's say people who are coming to this workshop today, you may learn a few things and they say, okay, well, that's something that I learned that I didn't know before about a different group of people. And I consider that would be part of your cultural competence. So, but being cultural responsive means that you really understand your own cultural worldview. You understand, where you come from. You are very aware of your own culture, and you understand your attitudes towards other cultures, and you do maybe have acquired some knowledge about different cultural practices, different cultural worldviews, and you may have developed some cross-cultural skills. So you are able to maybe use that and put that in action when you are maybe working with survivors of sexual violence. So that's what we consider cultural responsiveness. And cultural humility is more referring to our own ideas, our own process of how we think of people, and how we, the biases that we may have, that we have to work on, the ideals that we have in regards to our own attitudes, how we understand other people's experiences. So cultural humility is thinking of a journey, of a lifelong journey, in which there is no end goal. You are not saying that, at some point, like, oh, I know everything there is to know about Latinos, let's say. And unfortunately, we never are going to know everything there is about any specific group. And that's the kind of attitude that we should have when we're talking about cultural humility. It is a process, it is a commitment, because you are really committing to saying that, I'm going to keep an open mind about who I'm going to have in front of me. And that's beneficial not only for the person that's in front of you that you may be working with, but it's also beneficial for ourselves, because I cannot tell you how much more enriched my life is because of having that kind of a attitude, or working on my own attitudes. Do I have biases? Absolutely. But, I try my best to work on them and make sure that, that they don't interfere with the process of learning from others, especially when we're working on social ills like domestic violence, sexual violence, any kind of gender-based violence. So that's one way of putting it together, is as that attitude for a lifelong journey. Something else that is important that we understand is that some of these concepts that sort of intersect when we're working in gender-based violence, and those are the concept of identity. How did the person that's in front of us identify? What their concept of violence is, which is going to be different depending on where they're coming from. what are their experiences with systems of help? Have they had good experiences? Have they had bad experiences? What kind of community they're part of, and what's the kind of support that they're receiving. Community can be both a source of healing, validation, support, but also can be a source of threat and injury and harm, depending on our communities. And also understanding the isms, which is what we call, like, for example, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism. All of those intersect when we're doing this kind of work. Any questions so far? Amelia, please let me know if you see any questions. I don't think I'm seeing right now the chat.
Of course.
Okay. And then understanding culture is also understanding that it can be used in a positive way or a negative way, depending if it's strength-based. For example, we're saying strength-based, we'll say, oh, Latinos are very resilient people. It could be based also on research. If you've done some research or if you're reading some research, that could be a strength-based. But it could be also deficit-focused. If you're saying, referring to violence and a specific group, and I say, oh, yeah, that is part of their culture. Well, that's sort of like a negative way of focusing on culture. And like I mentioned before, violence in our experience of it is often interlinked with our experience of our own culture. And what we believe justice is depends on our culture and our experience. I'm gonna show you guys this video. It's about 4 minutes, and then we'll talk about it. I hope I want you to focus on what you're seeing, what you're feeling, or what you're hearing in this video, and hopefully let me know, Amelia, if you cannot hear it, please.
A bunch of kids are like making fun of me, like, why does your mom say your name weird? And I was offended a little bit. I was acting and singing in my first musical play. I noticed that my mom was sitting right in the restricted front row area. She wasn't allowed to do that, but I mean, I love it.
I remember my teacher said that I was doing really bad in history, and it was just very embarrassing too because I had to translate that to my mom.
There was this time that the dryer broke, and then my dad likes to fix everything, but he goes to the store and comes home and he tells me, I need a thermostat. I'm like, Dad, I don't know, there's no thermostat. And he talks to the guy again, and then I'm like, you wanted a thermostat this whole time. He was like, sometimes you just have to try to understand what I'm saying.
The telemarketer, they'd come, she'd say, hey, come talk to them, and I would stand on the phone. I'd find out that they're trying to convince me, like a 7 to 8 year old, trying to sell me insurance, and I don't know how to respond to that.
Every afternoon, my mom would walk my brother and I down to the park in our community. This little girl started kicking sand in my direction. My mom, without touching her, she puts her hand over her legs and she just says, stop. She ran off. There were 4 or 5 big women pushing each other out of the way, grabbing each other by the shoulder, saying, let me get a piece of her, let me get a piece of her. My mom just sort of stood there like, why are you talking to me? I don't know what's going on. I sit in front of her, 8-year-old me, and I just did this with my hands to protect my mom. There were all these horrific things that were being said to my mom, and I had to translate all of that. I lost it. Now I was crying, and I, standing behind her, holding onto her shirt. Soon enough, boom, punched straight to the face.
Because her priorities were always work, work, work in order to survive, she had no time and energy to dedicate to learning English.
When it comes to shame, I feel like not only do they feel it, but I get the first wave of that shame, having to hear things like, well, why don't your parents speak English? You know, while your dad or your mom are here in the background saying things like, oh, that lady, she didn't treat us very well. You know, she spoke like she was very mean.
Since I was a young child trying to help translate for my parents, people always had this idea that I didn't have the capabilities of understanding what the conversation was about.
And I know that when I was, younger, I'd get so frustrated asking my parents, Mom, can you help me write a sentence? I'm sorry, Mika, I don't know how to do that. Go ask your dad. Okay, Dad, can you help me write a sentence? I'm sorry, Mika, I don't know how to do that.
She came home from work and she was like acting very frustrated and I was like, Mom, like what's up? And she was like, sir, you don't understand. And I was like, what do you mean, Mom? And she's like, I'm stupid. And she said, I'm slow. I'm uneducated. And that's how I knew my biggest regret in my entire life is that I didn't teach my mom more English when I was a kid.
My dad was a veteran in the Vietnam War. My parents had to flee the country. So every time I have to translate for them, I think about why do I even have to do that? And it's because they sacrificed so much to be here for me.
Now that I'm older, I feel like they don't even need to learn English. Knowing more than I should know about my parents as a younger kid makes me feel much more capable to take care of them when they're older.
I just want to tell my parents how much I'm grateful for them, regardless of sometimes this forced responsibility of having to be there and translating for them. It's the least I can do to repay them for all their sacrifices.
Mommy, con thương má nhiều lắm. It means I love you, Mom, very much. A bunch of kids.
All righty. So now I want you to please say in the chat, or if you want to come on video or sound, and let me know, what did you see, feel, or hear? Your first, impression of this video. What is it about? What the, anything that you saw, felt, or heard. And Danisha says compassionate. Anybody else? Heartbroken. Let's see. This was emotional because it resonated a lot to a lot of the speakers. There was definitely a lot of empathy. Thank you. Eliana, it made me very sad, and I relate because I'm Mexican and it is hard to raise my kids in a different culture. Relatable, says Linda. Anybody else? Let's see. This is heartbreaking to hear the stories of hate, but I'm glad these parents have raised their kids to be so strong. Thank you, Cassandra. Let's see, what else? Claudia says, I see how much love these people have for their parents. Also, I can relate. Alma says, I heard similarities. My mom learned English right away, but my dad has always had a harder time learning. So I would see some of these issues with him would make me so angry at the ignorance of people. Thank you. And Menaka says, so powerful. Kids of immigrants take a lot of responsibilities, and even when their parents are in crisis. Thank you. That's so true. How unfair that these kids had to grow up so fast by being translators. Yes. Yes. And we, part of the best practices that we don't have kids translate or interpret for adults. Let me see what else. Jasmine said, how unfair that this kid to grow. Oh no, that's already with that one. Kayla, it made me think of my aunt and uncles that always have to translate for my great grandmother, and she wants us to understand her and she gets frustrated. Thank you. Thank you so much for this, for sharing the initiatives. It makes me think about the population we work with and how many children have to translate for their parents. Yes, thank you. And if you think about it, there's, a lot of their, as they're expressing these stories, a lot of their culture comes through also, or you can maybe infer, what type of culture or, what kind of values, and, some of you have made some judgments of value, for the values that these people have, saying, it's good that they raised strong kids, with great values and that kind of stuff. So, so it is one way to see how culture and language intertwine. And this is just on everyday situations that these adults now that are when they were kids saw, but when we're working with survivors of gender-based violence, it's a little bit more complex, and we need to understand that sometimes it's just the people, go back to the language, their first language when they are in crisis. They are going to refer to the first language if they feel that they get more support under that language, or they are, that's just automatic, the language that they may go when something awful happens to them. Understanding also when we're talking about, this intertwining of language and culture, understanding that language can be, so important that it could be a source of power for a community if they are able to use that language to express, their values, to express their identity, their cultural identity. If they lose it, as some of us, sometimes, we tend to lose it if we don't use it. If over time people lose their language, can be associated with the loss of cultural identity, and language can be lost for a variety of reasons. And sometimes, some other languages are imposed over others, and that's, because there is in at least in mainstream society here in America, we do have English as a more powerful language, and and it's imposed on everybody, as we ask everything pretty much in English, or everything for the most part has to be done in English. So that's why it's so important that language access is provided from an ethical point of view. It's so important that language access is provided. What is the language does not exist in isolation. Language is part of culture. Language and culture are the core of all human society, if you think about it. Throughout history, different cultures have expressed and have left legacies through language, either if it was through hieroglyphs, like the Egyptians back then, or if it was through a specific language, whichever that language was. And language is a symbolic system through which people communicate and transmit culture. So that's why it's so important. And for us, it's very important because when we are working with individuals who are going through gender-based violence, it's very important that we provide services in their own language. It's important that we understand the person that the culture of the person that is sitting in front of us that we're trying to help. We gotta be mindful of the effects that trauma has on communication, especially when we're talking about sexual violence, victims or survivors. Trauma has a huge effect on communication, on processing information, on remembering information. You know that better than I do. When people just don't give us the whole story, give us pieces of a story, and we need to understand that when we don't provide language access, that's sort of like it's truncated. It's just they don't get the same chance than those who are English speaking. or or to say, hearing individuals, if we're talking about those who are deaf and hard of hearing. Language access is not just a contract with the language line. When we're talking about in the framework of being culturally responsive and using language access, is not only having one bilingual staff person. I've been doing work with lately with on the Vicarious Trauma project, Vicarious Trauma Response Initiative. And one of the things that we were doing with one of the cities that participated was that they, in one of the trainings that I provided, they were mentioning that a lot of the people who were bilingual, they were just not receiving the same services than everybody else, or not the same access to resources. Because if it's only in one language, then they were not able to receive the same services or the same resources. Language access is more than translating materials. It is a commitment of your organization. And you are able to see the survivor as whole and create meaningful collaborations with others in your community to address their needs. We're going to look at, let's see how we're doing with time. Yes, let's look at this other video that, it really tells us a little bit of a story about why language access is important. And let me know, Amelia, if we don't hear it, please.
Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry. Look, she's been crying nonstop. She has a temperature of 105. I don't know what to do.
Marapedik. And vi paroles lesant.
No, please. Just every time I feed her, she throws up. I don't know.
Vi paroles
I don't understand what you're saying. What are you saying? Can you just look at her? No, she's burning up. Just feel.
Faju paroles la anglan.
No, what? She's burning up. Feel her head.
Tranquilly, kananche. The Monday is Askan.
What is he doing?
Do you have?
My baby, she's got a temperature of 105. Every time I feed her, she throws up. Please, can you?
She's
burning up. Feel her head.
Marapedik.
Please, just feel her head. Feel her head. Just someone let me in to see the doctor. No, does anyone understand what I'm saying? Please, someone help me.
8% of U.S. citizens speak limited English. For these 25 million Americans, professional interpreters can mean the difference between life and death.
All righty. So now my first question for you is after you've seen this video is, how did you feel when you watched this video? Anybody? Feel free to write in the chat. Panicked, says Jasmine. Thank you. Panicked, yes. Frustrated, I felt frustrated and helpless. Thank you. Sad for those who have gone through this. Helpless. What else? Anything else? Overwhelmed. Thank you, Claudia. Angry. I empathize with her fear and panic. Super anxious, I'm tearing up. I'm a new mom. That baby cry will get every time. I can't even imagine not being able to get help for my baby. Thank you, Amelia, for saying that. Anybody else? It's yes, it is an emotion provoking kind of video. And it is anybody has ever been in a foreign country where you did not speak the language, and maybe you had to, you were just having a hard time being able to transmit what you needed, whether it was a hospital or whether it was, yes, I have. Heather's please tell us if anybody can tell us what was that like. That would be great. And you can put it in the chat or come on video, whichever you feel more comfortable. Anybody else? Okay, I was hit by a van and could not, let me see. I was hit by a van and could not get help. Everyone just looked at me and did not understand how to help. Thank you, Heather, for sharing that. Yes, it's really scary and it's super vulnerable being in the situation where you can't speak the language. You don't know how to ask for help or receive help. Thank you. That's very. Thank you for sharing your personal experience. Jasmine says, I was in Germany for a few months and didn't know German. They assumed I was Syrian. Let me see. And I would get yelled at by all white men. I only understood that they wanted my card. I was scared to go anywhere alone. Thank you. That's a horrible experience. Alma says, yes, Germany for 1 year. I had to get my residency. And I remember them switching and pretending they didn't understand my German or suddenly forget English. I remember almost crying out of frustration because my visa was almost done. I had limited German. Thank you. And thank you for saying that you had a limited German, because that means that a lot of people in the US have a limited English proficiency. That means that they are in a continuum of learning a language. And it could be anywhere in that continuum. My first language is Spanish, and my second language is English. And I started learning it probably when I was about 7 or 8 years old. But really until I moved to the United States, I really did not put those skills into using them and being able to learn really well English. So, but even myself, with as much knowledge as I have of the criminal justice system and doing this kind of work, if I have to go to court, I would be a little panicked for, whatever reason I would be going for, and then trying to figure out everything and what to say and what not to say, what kind of, legalese language that sometimes we use in courts or within the criminal justice system. So it is very different. It is traumatic to a certain extent when it's not our first language. Claudia says, when I got to the US, I did not speak nor understand the language. It was scary and there was a feeling of isolation. Thank you, Claudia. And when we're talking about language access for survivors or victims, we know that if we don't provide it, there's a big chance that those people are not going to get the outcome that they deserve. Whether it is that they are looking for and they're usually all victims are looking for access to justice, access to healing, or access to safety sometimes in the first place. So some of the consequences of the lack of language access for the victim are, they might lose their life, or they might, their safety may be compromised, or they get harmed in some way. If programs are not accessible, survivors will not seek help. I hear all the time from organizations across the country, or even the counties, or anybody that reaches to us saying that, well, we are not getting the immigrants coming to our to law enforcement and reporting crime. Well, so then we start talking, and then we figure out that there are several roadblocks that they have put in the way, and that's why survivors cannot seek help. And one of those is that they do not provide sometimes language access. Also for the victims, the lack of community trust in the organization. Many times when we provide someone with a bad experience, that leaves a mark, and that may cause that person that never come back to our organization. And if and that person is not going to keep that information to themselves, especially in smaller communities, in immigrant communities, and they are going to tell everybody in their family, everybody in their friends, that they did not get a good service when they went to this organization. And once you get a bad reputation, it's hard to change that. So it's a lot of work to actually be able to do that. And sometimes, we're constantly re-victimizing the survivor because it's just not able to tell their story. They keep telling their story and nobody's really hearing what they're saying. For law enforcement, it could be that they're in the case of domestic violence, they may be arresting the victim instead of a perpetrator. For the agency, I've already mentioned, also the challenges to quality of service and the ability to fulfill their mission. If we are only serving, let's say my community has about 20% people that speak other languages and we don't provide language access. So when we're thinking that we're fulfilling our organizational mission, well, we're only fulfilling at 80%, really, not 100%. So we need to make sure that we provide language access so we are able to fulfill our organizational missions. And if you are also not complying with the law, that's also not good for your organization. And there could be liability issues, and I'll get more into that. So what is systems advocacy? System advocacy is an effort to change policies, rules, or laws which determine how services are provided. There's all kinds of policies that we have to work with most of the time, whether they're put together there by the criminal justice system, law enforcement agencies, governmental agencies, even policies within nonprofits. You might be a nonprofit who are providing community advocacy, and well, there's some policies within your organization that are interfering with providing good services to everybody or providing access for everyone. So when we're doing some system advocacy, we're trying to change those policies. And when we're talking about language access, system advocacy, what we're trying to do is first trying that someone maybe is complying with the laws. But that would be only the, if you're only complying with the laws and regulations, that's only the floor, what we call in when we're talking about language access best practices. Now, what we're trying to do is ensure that those who have limited English proficient or who have no actual English language proficiency, or those who are deaf or who are hard hearing, are able to receive the same exact information, the same kind of programs, the same type of services at a level that is equal to those who are English proficient and to those who are hearing individuals. That would be the ceiling. It's just what are the best practices that help us everyone to receive that services at an equal level. And there are laws and regulations that, in case you didn't know, the legal requirements for those who are LEP or limited English proficient is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Provides the legal basis to defend those who are not receiving language access. How? Because there is such a thing as a discrimination on the basis of nationality, and one of those ways of someone is being discriminated based on their nationality is discriminating on language, on the language that they speak. So not providing language access is a civil rights violation. When it comes to those who are deaf and hard of hearing, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or the Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, are sort of the law of the land that defend those individuals for receiving services in the whether it is an ASL for those who are deaf, or whether if that someone who is hard of hearing is requesting any kind of hearing, whether it's captions, whether it is anything else that they need for them to have an equal service, an equal type of services. For those who are LEP, there's requirements for recipients of federal funds. So if your organization is, for example, receiving funds from the government, from federal funds, like a grant, then you are obligated to take some reasonable steps to ensure that those who are LEP or limited English proficient have a meaningful access to the benefits and services provided by your organization. So, so it's tied up to the monies that you receive. And some people may say, well, we don't get federal grant. We receive mostly of our grants are through the state. Well, you might need to check and see who's where those funds originated. You might be receiving from a state entity, but there might be a pass-through funder that is actually giving you federal funding, and you are obligated. And that's whether you receive $1 or 100,000. For when it comes to those who are hard of hearing or deaf, we talk about there is no requirements of funding. It doesn't matter if you get funded or not. What it matters is if you are a place of public accommodation, and most places, most nonprofit organizations, most governmental offices are going to be a place of public accommodation. So you have to ensure that communication with people who are deaf or hard hearing is equally effective. And that is the legal standard. However, effective communication is the legal standard that we talk about when it is for those who are deaf and hard hearing. And the goal is to ensure that communication with those folks is equally effective. And there is a difference. I mentioned, that meaningful access for those who are limited English proficient and effective communication for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. And that's important because unfortunately, for those who are LEP, effective communication is a much stronger legal standard. And you will, and someone who is discriminated based because they are deaf or hard of hearing and they're not provided for with a communication tool, it's very likely that your organization is going to be found at fault. However, a meaningful access is not such a high standard; it's a much lower standard, and what is it? But still, depending on if you receive funding, you might actually lose funds if somebody files a civil rights complaint against you. Any questions so far? Anybody has any questions? I know that I'm sort of going through a little fast, maybe some of this legal stuff, and I am not an attorney, so you can actually I have some resources at the end that you can find a lot more information about some of the legal obligations that we have as providers. So any other questions? Anybody? No? All righty.
Ileana says,
yes.
How does this apply to services offered virtually, especially education, meaning classes or presentations?
Virtually. It does not change, regardless of how you receive the services. If you are not taking the necessary steps for someone to receive like for example, today we are, I believe that TASA has offered people to provide services in another language, and if they need it, or if they needed any kind of caption, that was, I believe that was offered when people were signing up for the workshops. So that's one way of complying. There's no difference whether you're doing it in person or whether you're doing it virtually. Now, there is some, when you're doing things virtually, especially for those who are deaf or hard hearing, it could be a little bit more complicated sometimes, because people may try to use the first option that they think is the best, and sometimes it's not the best. So that's one way, just to figure out what are the best practices when we're using providing ASL, for example, for those who are deaf. What you say, definitely you have to provide, for example, in a workshop, let's say like this, ideally you have to have at least two interpreters that they can take turns, so they can actually have a little bit of time to rest in between, and they probably will be changing every 15 minutes. So learn a little bit more about what are the best practices when we're providing language access in a virtual setting. It's very important that you do that. I usually have a whole complete training about a language access provision, in which I talk a lot about which ways are the best practices to provide language access to those who are LEP. And I have worked for many years. I worked also with the Vera Institute of Violence, which they have a lot of great resources when it comes to those who are deaf. And also I work with because I am hard of hearing myself, so I work with the Hearing Loss Association of America, and I'm part of the Jacksonville chapter here where I live in Florida. And those are great resources, and I think they're listed at the end. So I'm gonna make sure that they are there. If not, I'll send the resources to Amelia for her to share with the materials. Okay. But going back to, thank you for that question. Going back to language access systems advocacy, which is what we're trying to do, is we know that we need to provide linguistically appropriate and culturally responsive services, but they're not happening. So sometimes, we have to identify what the problem is first, and then see how can we go about it. How can we change that? And the way that we find out about the problem, sometimes it could be that maybe we learn about an individual that maybe had a bad experience, and we say, okay, that's not too good. What can we do about that? Okay, maybe just start doing some advocacy on behalf of all the individuals that are coming in contact with that agency, whichever agency that is. And maybe sometimes it's not that you hear about an individual. Maybe you've been working in an agency and you hear like example after example, people are telling you, oh, this agency is not providing what is services. I worked years ago I was working with in Georgia, in the county, that there was a judge who was really, really supportive of language access and making sure that everybody in the county would receive things in their language, so they'll be able to come to court if they need it, if they were victims of a crime. And so we were doing some lunch and learn series in which we were bringing some Latina women and talking to them about, even she was part of the presentation. She would come and we would have an interpreter that would explain what she was saying about the court, and how welcome the court was for anybody, regardless of, even immigration status, wherever that was. And throughout that lunch and learn, all of a sudden we started hearing different women throughout saying that the welfare office was telling everybody that if they were coming in without an interpreter, that they needed to turn around and leave and come back when they had an interpreter. So that was, of course, brought my attention, and I said, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden everybody said, yes, I went there and also I had a problem, somebody else. And all of a sudden we had close to 10 people that had a problem that they were told that. All of a sudden that, that's a systemic problem. And what he's saying, we work along with the judge and with other folks in the county, and that office actually changed their practices. but it took a while, and it took actually several steps. So you have to make sure, because sometimes system advocacy is a long-term thing. You have to have patience. Things may not happen right away. And sometimes you have to have a little bit of patience, because we know that people are, most people are well-intentioned, and that, if we bring it up to their attention, that they will do what's right. Sometimes, they just need to learn different things maybe about the process of changing whatever that is that they need to change. So, so we have to be, make sure that we identify who are the decision makers. Sometimes we're just not going to the person that may not have any kind of access to making those changes. So gaining access may take a while. So, and there's different ways of doing that. Sometimes it's, you take the diplomatic route and you just start, contacting the first one in that chain of command. You don't see any changes, then you go to the next person and the next person, and so on and so on. And I've done that kind of a system advocacy before. Or sometimes you go like I work with a judge with a coalition building route. You find other allies in your community and say, hey, did you hear about this? We need to do something. Can you help me with this? And then yes, you leverage the power and the maybe the leverage that others may have in that community to make sure that the changes happen, and then that may happen actually faster. And as I mentioned, you have to identify the issue first. What is it about language access or about cultural responsive services that is not happening? Not using interpreters, using children as interpreters, whatever that is, you identify the issue, and then understand all the laws and regulations, get more read a lot more about what is it that, what kind of laws and what kind of regulations apply to that particular situation, and then document all the instances. If you're working and all of a sudden you said, oh, here's a survivor that came to me and she didn't receive an interpreter when she needed it, and then a month later, in the same organization denied an interpreter to another one. Well, just document all of that, because then you can go to that organization and say, hey, in the past year, we just got about 5 complaints about your organization, and I think that maybe it should be done. What can we do? Let's work together. You have to be assertive, but also kind, and not try to ruffle feathers. But if nothing happens, then yes, you may have to. We have to educate people about the legal obligations, but we also have to figure out about the impact. How is impacting people? Is this something menial or something that it really is impacting people? Like, for example, I worked with a survivor a few years back, and he was a gay survivor in Georgia, and the victim services organization from the court was sending him everything, and even though he was LEP and they already knew that he was limited English proficient, Spanish speaking, they were sending everything, all the communications through the mail in English. And one of those was the impact statement. They were asking for his impact statement in English. So he had no idea. So by the time that I started working with him, we realized, oh, they ask you for this in English. And of course you don't know, because if I receive, a legal letter and I'm trying to figure out what is this about, many times it's just not simple. We try to make everything so much more complicated than it is, and putting things in simple language is the best thing, the best practice for when we're trying to ask people to participate of our legal system. So in this case, we started working with that organization, and of course they changed their communications and started doing it in Spanish and translating everything, all the documents that he was receiving. But otherwise, it could have been, he could have been deprived of giving his statement of impact, how the whole situation had impacted him. And in his case, it was a DV and sexual violence case, and he was his partner was being very abusive and also being sexual violent, which is forcing him to have sex with other guys without his consent. And then eventually in one incident that they had, he threw him off the balcony. It was from the first floor, and he landed on some bushes that so he has some physical injuries, but not life-threatening. Thank goodness to that he fell on top of the bushes. So let me see, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So going back to the system advocacy, when you have tried this route, when you have tried, to be diplomatic, when you have tried everything and the organization still not doing anything, maybe then you can say, okay, talk to, if it's a specific person that you're working with and that they're going to be impacted, then you ask, for their input, saying, hey, I think it should be best for us to maybe file an Office of Civil Rights violation, and that depending on where it happens, it could be it could be filed under a different organization. Like if it was, somebody was asking about education services. If it's under education, then you go through the Department of Education. If it happened at when they were having a forensic, interview, and it's maybe it's under the Department of Health and Human Services, or if it was under under the Department of Justice, that's where you file it. And here are the links. I checked it recently. I think they're all working links, but please let me know, Amelia, if there's any issue with those links. And if that still doesn't yield any changes, then you can actually file a lawsuit. And we work, I worked with a couple of years back with someone from the organization VIP, Violence Intervention Program in New York, where they were one of the plaintiffs in a case called Yanahit Padilla Torres et al. Versus the City of New York, where there was several survivors which they were not granted, they were not given a language access or the possibility to understand, and that impacted, many of those cases impacted their outcomes, and including on some of those was the case of Rosie Garcia, I believe that her name was, she did several complaints with the department, with law enforcement, and they did with NYPD, and they never translated, even they were all written complaints, and those were never translated from Spanish to English, and they just sat in a drawer, and eventually she died at the hands of her partner. So you can check this link and hear about Cecilia Gaston, who was the executive director of the organization that helped along with other organizations in the community and a group of survivors who were brave enough to be plaintiffs. Eventually, the City of New York decided to settle this out of court, and and they indemnified, of course, the plaintiffs, but also the biggest thing was that they make a long list of changes that the City of New York and specifically the department, the law enforcement department needed to make, and and they were held up to those standards. So that's the last resort that you want to take if changes are not happening in your community or with a specific organization or governmental agency, whichever that is. So any questions? I know this is a lot of information. Any questions so far? And I know we have about 15 minutes left, I think. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that it's very important when you're doing this kind of work is that you consider, of course, the survivor's autonomy. You know, I worked with someone many years ago who actually I was a youth advocate, and her child, she was a domestic violence survivor, and her child, at school was told that he was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and an ADHD, and he was told by an officer at the school that that if he didn't change his behavior, that he was gonna have him deported. And even though the child was born here and the mother was a green card holder, so which is irrelevant in the case. So of course I worked with her, in trying to go through that situation. First, they were given an interpreter during the meetings, which we had to reschedule until they provide language access. And then eventually, we started doing step-by-step, going to a different person in that chain of command to see what changes. And at all times, I always was checking with her if it was okay with the responses that they were receiving. Eventually, they made some changes. They were not the changes that she wanted, not all the changes that she wanted, or that I thought that it was, in my advice, that it was sufficient. But so at some point, I told her, I said, I think that it might be good for maybe to file an OCR violation, an Office of Civil Rights violation. And at that point, she told me, well, you know what? I think that we got as much change as I think that we are going to get. So I don't want to keep going further than this. And at that point, I was like, yes, I want to file it. We need to do this. Because that was just me being selfish and not thinking about the survivor's autonomy and not thinking about what's good for the survivor and what the survivor wants. So of course, I stopped at that moment and I said, yes, whatever that you think it is the best course of direction, we will follow that. And then I had the good thing about finding her many years later, and she says, do you know what? She said, I know that we went, we did so much with that when that happened to her child. She said, but you know what, right now I can go to the school and I can tell people, what's going on, and they respect me and they are doing, I can be much more assertive. And I thought, well, if that's not what we want survivors to do, to be self-sufficient, to be, that's the ultimate outcome. So it was, actually very a learning experience for me to hear those, and I think that that's what we always need to do is to respect survivors' autonomy. Always, think of any confidentiality issues that we do not want to break confidentiality. Think of unintended consequences. Sometimes we may be well-intentioned, but something may happen to that survivor. Let's say someone who is undocumented and maybe as a result of all the actions that we're taking, they might be detained or they might be deported. Well, that's not something we thought that maybe was going to happen, but it may happen. Was an unintended consequence, and we have to be aware of that. Learn more about those kind of situations. Explain that to the survivor. Say, hey, this is what may happen if we do it. I think that you should do it, but this is what can happen. 1, 2, 3, and be completely transparent with survivors about what can happen when this is the case. And like I mentioned earlier, it was not about me. It's not about you. It's about the survivors. So I hope that this is helpful And I did include some of the resources here, some of the toolkits that we have in our website. It's a great document that our research department created on children as interpreters and how to avoid that and what can you say to anybody who's doing that. The Hearing Loss Association of America. I was part of the National Resource Center for Reaching Victims a few years back. It was an OVC project for 3 years that has a great resource library. So you can access it there and get a lot of information about language access, things that we didn't talk about it today, but then maybe if you have the time, there's a webinars recorded there that you can access. There's a whole language access, curriculum that's called Translating Justice. And also I put here the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, which has a lot of great resources as well. So any questions? I know we have about 9 minutes, but anybody has any questions, any comments, anything that you want to let me know. Here's my direct information. If you want to check reach out, get feedback on anything that's going on, that maybe any specific situation that you run into, and you say, hey, Leo, I want to know about this. What do you think? I'll be glad to provide you with feedback anytime. And or if your organization needs training on anything related to these topics, I'll be glad to talk about it. Anything? Anybody? No? If
Just
not,
feel free to unmute yourself too. You don't have to type in the chat. We do have a little bit of time if folks want to go ahead and unmute themselves.
yeah. And I'll just pass it on to Amelia now. And I think, is there an evaluation, I think, Amelia, for the workshop, I think?
Yes, yeah. So if you all don't have any questions, I can just thank you so much, Leo, for all of this information. There were a few times where I was just like jotting things down. I think folks are really hungry in our state to, feel like we can navigate these types of conversations, and oftentimes they're uncomfortable conversations. Gaps in services. Nobody wants to talk about or address gaps in services. If anybody was at the journey mapping session this morning, if you happen to be in person as well, as we were talking about, just seeing what a client who comes to our organization, what their journey looks like. And sometimes those gaps are they're gaping. So really just thank you so much for sharing everything. And definitely want to give folks an opportunity to ask questions or to write down Leo's information. Thank you for offering folks the ability to reach out. We super appreciate that. Before folks head out, I would love, Cassandra says, thank you for sharing your knowledge. This info is very helpful. I says, thank you so much. It's definitely so helpful to be inclusive in our field of work. We just need to always be open and humble to learn more and meet our clients where they're at. Appreciate it.
Thank you.